Alright guys, hello again. So we're going to go ahead and keep going on with our classification chapter. So we are getting really close to the end of the year. There are just a couple more things I want to teach you about when it comes to some of this classification stuff. And then final exams, if you have maintained a C or higher, and we're doing this like school-wide, so your other teachers may have already talked about this with you. If you have maintained a C or higher throughout the school year, you do not have to take the final, which is kind of awesome. If you want to take the final for whatever reason, just let me know, okay? And then for those of you who maybe have not maintained a C or higher, so if you have a D or lower average for the year, you will be taking the final, and I will be contacting you via email/Google Classroom to let you know about that. Okay. But other than that, let's go ahead and get right back into our classification chapter. So we left off in our last one, right before you got to listen to one of my favorite awesome classification rap videos. I hope you enjoyed it. It's interesting nonetheless, right? We were talking about the three domains. So remember, there was domain archaea, domain bacteria, and then domain eukaryota. Okay, so what we see is that those domains, those are the big overarching topic. Then when you get more specific, okay, so it goes domain, and then the very first one, if you remember your KPCOFGS, is our kingdom. So we actually have 6 kingdoms, okay? If you remember originally, Aristotle basically just categorized 2 kingdoms of animals, not of animals, of organisms. So he grouped them into plants and animals. Nice start, but did not include all the stuff that we have found to this day. And so these 2 kingdoms were then later divided into 5. So we had plants, animals, fungi, protists, and bacteria. Sometimes this bacteria one was nicknamed Monera, which is just referring to your prokaryotic organisms. And these 5 kingdoms were taught for a very long time, as like I mentioned when I took biology in high school. Our textbooks, and even the old textbooks that we had at Crestview, had only 5 kingdoms to it. Okay. However, as you see in the title, there's not 5 anymore. So what happened is that this bacteria kingdom, this Monera kingdom, then got split up into your eubacteria and your archaebacteria, as we're going to see on this next slide. So we had 5, but because of the genetic differences between the archaebacteria and eubacteria, that bacteria kingdom actually got split into 2. Alright, so now we recognize 6 kingdoms. So as I mentioned, that previous Monera or bacteria kingdom are no longer, because you have your archaebacteria, which are your ancient bacteria. They're the bacteria that we talked about earlier this year that lives in really extreme places like the Great Salt Lake, the hot acidic sulfur pools, okay, places where no one else would really want to live. And then you have your eubacteria, which is like your common bacteria that you have. So the same bacteria that people use to make like dairy products, like cheeses and ice cream, the same bacteria you have in your stomach. Some of these bacteria might make you sick, like the Streptococcus bacteria. So based on what we found DNA-wise between these 2 groups of organisms, okay, that's actually one of the main reasons we split them up, okay, because genetically, even though they're both prokaryotes and they're both types of bacteria, they're actually very different from one another, okay, with their ability to adapt to extreme or non-extreme places, okay. So archaebacteria, eubacteria, both are prokaryotics. The other 4 are eukaryotic, and that includes your protists, the fungi, plantae, and animalia. Protists, or the Protista kingdom, is a kingdom filled with microorganisms, but they are, even though they're microorganisms and they're super small, okay, they're still technically eukaryotic because they have that nucleus. a lot of, if you remember the pond water lab that we looked at, that we did early this year when we were doing microscopes, a lot of what we were seeing were actually protists. Okay, so with your protists, they're kind of an oddball kingdom. There's a lot of pond microorganisms, there's a lot of water microorganisms, even some of the algae, so green and red algae are not actually plants, they actually fall in the protist kingdom. Okay, fungi, there you find your typical molds, mushrooms. What else do we find? There's some diseases associated with fungi, so athlete's foot, ringworm, okay, would be examples of some common diseases that are actually caused by fungus. Okay. And then plantae, plants, okay, and Animalia is the real name for our animal kingdom. Okay, and I know you can think of lots of examples for those. Okay, so what we've noticed when we look at this 6-kingdom system, there's actually a greater difference between the prokaryotes and eukaryotes than between plants and animals. Makes sense. We have a big difference between your bacteria and something that's eukaryotic as compared to plants and animals. But what we looked at, and one of the reasons why we had to divide them up, is that the difference between the two prokaryotic groups, so the difference between the archaebacteria and the eubacteria, is actually a greater difference than if we were to compare any of the eukaryotic groups. So if we look genetically, archaebacteria and eubacteria, I keep trying to combine those, eubacteria and archaebacteria are so different, okay, that if we were to compare maybe fungi and plantae, okay, there's actually more of a genetic difference between those two bacteria than the fungi and plant kingdoms. Okay, so that was one of the reasons why that 5th kingdom got split up into 2. Okay, there's just too many differences among them. Alright, so that leaves us with our 6 kingdoms. Plantae, Animalia, fungi, Protista, which is sometimes the one people forget, eubacteria, and archaebacteria. Okay. Now, as we have developed some of the better ways of classifying organisms, especially when it comes down to genetically testing organisms, I'm just going to put this okay, all up here. So we've been getting better and better at classifying these organisms and figuring out where we should put new species into this system. Some of the reasons why we are better at it than what we used to be. So we look at karyotypes, which if you remember, that's where we actually look at all the chromosomes lined up and then see how many chromosomes there are or what shape their chromosomes are. Okay, we look at biochemistry stuff, which is where we look and compare DNA and how similar or different they are. We can look at embryology, so the embryos of these species. We look at geographic distribution, so looking at some of the evolution stuff where we see if a species has evolved into 2 different species, that speciation that's occurred, due to geographic reasons. And then we also look at phylogeny, which is evolutionary descent. So looking at what species are closest to who, okay, and where we have common ancestors among them. Okay. So the actual name for this classifying of animals and kind of a subdivision of our classification is actually called systemic. So a systemic is something that uses a phylogenetic tree, which shows relationships thought to exist among groups of organisms. Okay, so there's some different tools, okay, different visuals that we can use to actually kind of help us place where our organisms need to be, at least on our quote family tree type of diagram. Okay. And I know I was just scrolling through that really fast. I actually think that's where I want to stop. That's a good stopping point because I want to save cladograms for our last video of the week. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop right here. As always, if you have any questions, let me know, and I hope you guys are doing well.